15 parts per billion is the normal level. You had almost 12,000, 11,846 parts per billion in March of 2016. So before I get into the other tests, tell me, when did you know there was a problem? Was the water tasting funky, smelling funky? What was your experience?
The water started tasting really funny tasting. When I made a cup of coffee, I had to dump it out because I couldn't tolerate the taste. So I went out and bought my own zero water filter because the city of Flint will not listen to the residents.
And so you mentioned the zero water filter. Now that's different than the filters they were giving the residents, because the
faucet filters do not filter out lead. They actually filter very little. I took a TDS meter and tested water in this apartment here, and it said 97 parts per million of something. Run it through the filter, it come out 92 parts per million. Now that tells me that filter is not working.
So basically, the filter the state gave you, it filtered out a little bit, but you still had way too high levels.
Faucets upstairs, I cannot use those faucet filters. They're too old. And the apartment down here can use the faucet filters because it's got no plumbing fixture in the sink.
So what I find interesting, you have in March of 2016, so over 2 years, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality comes over, and there's a test that shows 11,846 parts per billion. Obviously, well over 15 parts per billion. So that is toxic. I mean, if you're drinking that water, that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So that was the week of March. That was the date that was collected, was March 2nd, 2016. Okay, so they come back March 9th, so the next week, and they tested through the zero water filter you were talking about, and they found 4 parts per billion of lead. So obviously, the zero water filter, in a week's time, it went from 11,846 parts per billion of lead all the way down to 4 parts per billion. The main difference, the test that almost had 12,000 parts per billion was just straight out of the tap, whereas this, the one that had 4 parts per billion, was using the zero water filter. Here's where it gets very interesting, and I find suspect. They went back after the test that was 4 parts per billion with the zero water filter. They went back in April, the next month, testing just straight from the tap, and they found it to be 15 parts per billion. So how do you go from 11,846 parts per billion the first week of March down to 15 parts per billion the next month? The lead service lines here weren't changed yet, correct?
No, they were not. They did not change these lines until August of last year.
So basically in a month's time, put aside the test with the zero water filter, but first week of March, they find 11,846 parts per billion. Second week of April, they find 15 parts per billion. Nothing changed. Your service line wasn't changed out. You know, maybe they would say the phosphates they were adding to the pipes were working, but how do you explain, or how do you trust that you went down basically almost 12,000 parts per billion you went down in a month's time when they hadn't yet changed the pipes?
Right. And I cannot explain how that happens, but when they open up fire hydrants around here, I think that is what was changing the lead level rates.
How so?
Because to opening up the fire hydrants, our fresh water supply is connected with the fire hydrant. So when they open that up, I think they're flushing out the lines that has built up all the lead residue in there.
But it's interesting because the testing is all over the place. So you have 11,846, then a month later, 15. Then you got January 2017. So 6 months after that, more than 6 months after that one, You still got 15. Then you got the next month, you got 27, 24. So it seems like it's all over the place. And there's really not a lot of explanation. But even when they say it's going down significantly, the water still tastes gross and it still smells, you've said.
Well, I don't smell it that much, but it does taste gross to me. I drink my water out of the zero water filter, and I can give you a sample out of that to drink as well as this city water, and I guarantee you'll like the zero water taste better.
Well, let's try it. So the most recent test, because they changed the lead service lines here in August. They changed the lead service line here in August of last year, which means they have a brand new service line as of August of last year. So they just did a test here, it looks like beginning of May, and they found 2 parts per billion, which is fairly low. The EPA's limit is 15 parts per billion. So basically, after they changed the pipes, they're saying it's very, very low. So let me see how it tastes. So the best way I could describe that is it has this like sharp bite to it. It has a sharp bite to it that it's almost like it's bitter. It's bitter. And that's from the water that, according to them, is supposed to be drinkable. And again, the EPA's level of 15 parts per billion, the EPA level of 15 parts per billion is not something for public health, because most doctors, experts tell you the allowable level for lead in water would be 0. So even though it says 2 parts per billion, the allowable limit is 0. So let me ask you, you've been here for a long time. Before we went on air, we were talking about just the staggering level of corruption in Flint, not to mention Michigan. You're not a scientist. I'm not one, but seems to me the testing is all over the place. You have testing that says 12,000 parts per billion in March of 2016. The next month, they say down to 15 parts per billion. Do you trust what they're telling you?
No, I do not. But I'm not a scientist, so I can't confirm these test results. But I do not believe they are testing all the same. They're testing methods. I don't believe it's the same each time. Why would it be such a big difference in 30 days' time?
Yeah, because honestly, unless the pipe was completely changed to go from nearly 11,846 parts per billion, March 2nd of 2016, April 13th. So a month and a week later, 15 parts per billion. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, I've been covering this well enough, and I've spoken with experts, to go down from nearly 12,000 parts per billion down to 15 parts per billion. That's, people need to explain how you could go down. And that's part of the problem. There's not much communication between the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and residents like you.
No, there's not. I tried talking to a Jamie Hockmeyer. He was supposed to come over to my house and talk to me about the water situation, and he did not show up. And then I heard from you that he'd gotten another job out in Mount Pleasant, because he probably didn't want to have anything to do with this mess here in Flint.
So that's what I've heard from many residents. You have, for example, he was told this guy, Jamie Hockmeyer, was going to come, talk to him about his water, possibly test himself from Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Never shows up. I reached out to the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and mentioned his case, as well as other residents' cases of they're testing super high, but then they're trying to get in contact with you and nobody's communicating back. Of course, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, they tell me this guy don't work there anymore. And they don't know what I'm talking about with Bernard, but they'll be in touch with Bernard and, get to the bottom of it. But I've heard that from many, many residents. They get these tests It basically gives them very, very vague instructions on what it means or what to do. And then there's no follow-up. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, the bottom line is, I mean, I just tasted it. It's disgusting. I would not advise, I'm not drinking any more of that.